And actually what I really want to focus on this meeting is actually the recent developments that we've been seeing in Palestine. These recent developments have been going on really since May 2021, with what is known as the Unity Intifada. But actually I think, there's been even further developments from the top of Israeli society since the elections in November just last year. And I think this is why it's incredibly apt to talk about how can Palestine be free today, because there's an incredibly deep crisis at the centre of Israeli society, both at the top in terms of the Israeli political spectrum, but actually also I would argue there's a deep crisis on the ground, not just with Israeli citizens who seek to resist the new far right-wing government, but also there's big questions about the Palestinian liberation movement, the ways forward and so on, and the best ways for resistance. Actually I think it's quite telling what you see going on in Palestine at the moment, really about the prospects of liberation and what that can look like and how Palestine can win. So look, of course the title of this meeting is How Can Palestine Be Free? I think it's important to first lay out what we call for in the Socialist Workers' Party. When we talk about Palestine being free, we want to see a singular, secular, democratic state, one state in all of what is Palestine. That includes the borders of Israel, or what is known as sometimes 48 Palestine, as well as the occupied territories, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and so on. And I think it's really important that actually every single time we talk about Israel, we have to call it what it is. Israel is an apartheid state. It's a country in which one section of civilians, i.e. Palestinians, are suppressed to different laws than Israeli civilians. This is the definition of apartheid. It's a settler colonial state that gets its whole legitimacy and justification off of, illegal settlements, encroachment, forced evictions of Palestinians and so on. And really in this meeting, hopefully a lot of people in this room already know a little bit of a basis around the repression that Palestinians face on a daily basis, the creation of the Israeli state, and also, many of the problems that we faced here in Britain for the Palestine solidarity movement. I'm not going to focus on that too much here in the meeting, but obviously if people want to raise questions in the discussion, I really encourage it, because I think there's so many things that you could talk about when it comes to the question of Palestine. So to cover it all in just 25 minutes is quite a lot. So I want to focus really on, as I said, the current situation and what that means for what we say about the freedom of Palestinian for Palestine. So I think there's 2 points really I want to make when we talk about how Palestine will be free. The first point is that I don't think that any sort of solution which talks about a two-state solution is a viable or a desirable option, to be honest. Actually, the nature of settler colonialism within Israel makes it absolutely impossible for a two-state solution to be achievable. We've seen this really from the actions of Israeli governments since the Oslo Accords in 1993. But actually, if we were to have a two-state solution within Israel, i.e. a so-called democratic state of Israel and then an unchained Palestinian population just on Israel's borders, firstly, I think the main point we have to argue with this is that it will completely deny the right to return for the 7 million diaspora, or 7 million Palestinian diaspora who have come from the 800,000 people who were displaced in 1948. They would not be able to return to their homes within Israel's borders in places like Tel Aviv, Bethlehem, Haifa, and so on. I think also that when it comes to talking about a two-state solution and looking for a solution within Israel's borders, we actually have to do away with the notion that a sort of liberal or a left-wing Zionism would be able to bring this sort of thing about. Actually, I think this is quite a common argument that you see sometimes on the left, that just as we would with other international movements, we talk about working class solidarity, people, linking arms against the state and an oppressor. What I want to argue is that the ideology of settler colonialism, the nature of the Israeli state, makes it impossible. I don't think there's any sort of solution or liberation for Palestinians that can be won through both, for example, Palestinian working class and the Israeli working class working side by side. That's because of the ideology of Zionism, but also the nature of the fact that it's an apartheid state. So that's the first point. There can be no liberation for Palestine within Israel's borders. So then, how is it that Palestine can actually be free if it's not from within Israel? I'd like to argue that it's not from within Palestine's borders either. I think we've seen brave resistance against the Israeli state from Palestinians over the last 74 years now, I think, of Israeli apartheid and oppression. But actually, I don't think Palestinians can win alone. The nature of imperialism in the Middle East and the way in which Israel is tied up with US aid, its links to the Egyptian state, the Saudi state, the UAE and so on, actually the nature of imperialism in the Middle East means that, quite frankly, the might of the Israeli army means that Palestinians cannot win alone. In fact, actually, I would argue we need to look to broader movements across the Middle East in order to try and win Palestinian liberation. We want to turn to the working classes in the bordering countries from Syria, Jordan and so on, and actually argue that when they're involved in their own struggles, they need to take up the question of international solidarity with Palestine to see the fight for a liberated Palestine as wholeheartedly interlinked to the fight against our own rulers. So look, that's the sort of premise and the things that I want to get forward today, but I think it's important obviously to start with what is actually taking place in Israel today, and actually how is it that the current political situation in Israel actually reaffirms the argument that I want to try and make about how Palestine can be free. Well, look, it's worth noting that we are 74 days into 2023 and at least 71 Palestinians have died this year. That means that over 220 Palestinians have died since this time last year at the hands of the Israeli state. And I think it's important to say at least, right, because these are the documented deaths. That does not include the violent rampages that we see from settlers that I want to talk about a little bit later. It doesn't include, many of the undocumented deaths that go at the hands of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force as well. I think it's worth noting as well that of that 220 people who have died in the last year, an incredible amount of them are children. Some as young as, a couple of weeks old. Babies died in the bombings of homes in Gaza. This is how brutal the repression and the violence is of the Israeli state. And actually, in that last year, we've seen a massively increased clamping down on Palestinian resistance, particularly the Palestinian resistance that blossomed in the Unity Intifada in May 1921. This was an absolute revolt of Palestinian expression that was sparked by the forced evictions of a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem in occupied Israel, the forced evictions of people in their homes. It continued with the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, an 11-day bombing campaign in Gaza, and actually culminated not just in global protests. People may remember, we had the biggest demonstration in British history for Palestine during this time, but actually culminated in a general strike in Palestine on May the 18th in 2021. But actually since then, what we've seen is an increased repression of that Palestinian resistance. Just actually as you have always seen from all of the intifadas that have taken place, 1987, the early 2000s, the siege of Gaza, and so on. But also I think as well, more importantly, over the last couple months, you've seen an increased repression as well of Palestinians, particularly in the cities of the occupied West Bank, like the cities of Nablus and Jenin. And this is because of the new right-wing, terrifying Israeli government that we've seen that was elected last November and, like I said, took power in January. And actually, I think the elections last November were a warning sign. Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been president of Israel for a number of years now, was managed to sort out the sort of impasse, you could say, of the Israeli state, the political situation that had taken place at that point, and was managed to form a far-right coalition government with a party called the Religious Zionist Party. Now, his party, Likud, which is still, by the way, I think it's worth noting that the Likud members of the Knesset, which is the Israeli form of the Houses of Parliament, I guess, they make Tories look like nice people, I would argue. I mean, even on their economic policies, even if you look at the budget and what they're trying to do with refugees today here in Tories, they make the Tories look like nice people, Likud. But actually, and they're responsible for a vast amount of crimes over the years against the Palestinian people, forcing out of homes and the bombings of Gaza and so on. But currently, in order to form a government, they've entered into a coalition government with a party called the Religious Zionism Party, an incredibly nationalistic and fundamentally racist party. And actually, they've got really, really nasty characters at the heart of it. One of them is someone called Ben-Gvir. Look, and to be honest, if I stood here and explained all of the absolutely outrageously racist things that Ben-Gvir has said. Just over the last year, not even in his political career, I would be standing here all night. But he represents, in his position in the Israeli government, represents a marked shift to the hard right within Israel, which of course has disastrous effects for Palestinians. But I think there's just a few things that are worth noting about this guy called Ben-Gvir. He's an admirer of Mir Kahane. Mir Kahane is, people may have heard of the Kahanists. They're essentially a far-right, an extremely far-right group within Israel that talk about the complete disregard of Palestinians, the removal of any kind of rights of non-Jewish citizens within Israel. Mir Kahane was also the co-founder of the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, the body that is responsible for much of the killings of innocent Palestinians. And actually, this guy was convicted of terror charges against Palestinians in the 1990s. Ben-Gvir also has, up until recently, until he got pulled out of it, had a portrait in his office of Baruch Goldstein, a man who in 1994 massacred 29 Palestinians whilst they prayed. On Ben-Gvir's campaign, he went to the city, or the neighbourhood of Sheikh Jarrah, which of course, as we said, was the outpouring or the sort of central focus, the nucleus of the Intifada in 2021. I keep saying 1921, I don't know where my brain's at the moment. In 2021, he went there on his campaign trail and at a rally pulled out a handgun and encouraged his supporters to shoot Palestinians who threw stones. On the election result, when they managed to win a number of seats in the Knesset, his supporters argued or chanted death to terrorists. This was a very thinly disguised version of the old slogan of his party, which was death to Arabs. On winning his seat and then going into a coalition government, he said, "It's time to be the landlords of this country again." Firstly, I want to ask where Ben-Gvir's been in Israel since 1948, as if the Israelis weren't already the landlords and have been ever since they took over Palestine. But I think this is important to go through because this man is now the Minister of National Security within Israel. And actually, since this election, there has been sustained attacks on Palestinians, both from the military, from the top unit of state arms, but also from settlers, civilians on the ground. And I actually think as well, on top of this, there's been a sustained push from drastic legislative moves. I think, and there are two of which that I want to point out because I think they're significant. The first of which has just been actually, rushed through the Knesset, is the argument that anyone who is convicted of terrorism who has Israeli citizenship, there's lots of Palestinians who live within Israel's borders, or who have East Jerusalem residency, anybody who's found guilty of terrorism acts will be removed of their citizenship. Of course, let's be honest, the only people who are being found guilty of terrorism within Israel's borders are Palestinians. There's nobody else that this kind of policy affects. And I think furthermore, Ben-Gvir, the man who I just mentioned, he proposes that anybody who's found guilty of such terrorist acts should be, quote, sent to the electric chair. And I think this is important to note because within Israel, throwing stones at people who are attacking your homeland, burning your home down, who stand in front of you with bazookas, throwing stones is classed as a terrorist act. So I think it's quite an important distinction to make. Often the people who are throwing stones are children against, highly weaponized Israeli army. And I think additionally as well, these sort of arguments around the arguments around sort of criminalising people who supposedly attack innocent civilians, I think we have to make the argument that many so-called civilians, i.e. settlers within Israel, are far from innocent. In fact, the things that they do to Palestinian farmers and Palestinians living in their local villages goes far beyond just throwing stones at them. And actually this was made most clear, I think, recently on the 26th of February, when Israeli settlers went in on a late night rampage into the town of Harara. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, please somebody correct me in the discussion. In the town of Harara, one person was killed, 400 people were injured, and an uncountable amount of houses were burned to the ground. And I think it's quite important as well, because just as we always say, just like here in Britain, when you hear racist rhetoric at the top of society, it fuels the far right on the ground. It's worth noting that what is described actually by a left-wing, I use left-wing lightly, a left-wing minister in the Israeli government described this as a pogrom on the town of Harara. This took place just 11 days after the IDF went in and stormed the refugee camp of Nablus, killing 11 Palestinians. Nablus is literally just a couple, right next to the town of Harara. You can see the complete connection of state actions to then vast, really extreme forms of racism on the ground. A man called I can't actually read my handwriting, but his surname's Smoltrick. He's also the finance minister, head of the Religious Zionist party. He said after the events in Harara that Harara needs to be wiped out, the village of it. Actually, he was then forced to backtrack on these words, claiming it was simply a slip of the tongue. I question that. That was not a slip of the tongue. If you look at actually Zionist policy, particularly that of the far right, that is their goal, to wipe out Palestinian land across all parts of Israel, all parts of the uncolonized land as well. And actually, I think it's important to note, because these events in Harara and the actions at the top have created great tensions within Israeli society. Because what you begin to see is that there's two sort of arguments about how best to keep the occupation of Palestinians under control. From Netanyahu's Likud government, you have a forced extension of the military, the police, the state, legislative measures. And then from those on the far right, there's a tension of actually whipping up racism from the bottom, about actually inciting these pogroms and civilian measures. And I think it's worth noting as well, because actually there's been recently some quite interesting protests against another legislative measure, which is to do away with the judicial element of what the state can do regarding the occupation of Palestinians. i.e., even though under international law, what the IDF and the Israeli army, the Israeli police do on a day-to-day basis is illegal regarding to human rights law, they have their own supposed judiciary in Israel that keeps them to account. And what the government wants to do is they want to do away with this sort of legislative measure, essentially in order to give the government even more powers to do what they want. As a result of this, there's actually been mass protests across Israel called pro-democracy protests against these measures, saying that actually this is a threat to Israeli democracy. Israeli citizens who are concerned about the way in which this right-wing government is working. And I think it's quite interesting, because some people on the left think, well, this is great, right? Here is a group of Israelis who want to criticize the government, want to criticize the occupation of Palestinians, criticize the racism at the heart of it. And actually, I think we have to be quite blunt about the nature of these protests, because quite frankly, that's not what the case actually is. None of these protests have actually worked to try and work with the local Palestinian communities who are being affected by these. Why? Because actually the leaders of the protests know as soon as they bring in Palestinian voices, it's going to completely undermine the legitimacy they have in any form of sort of legal or political sphere within Israel's government. But actually, ultimately, the anger over these pro-democracy protests and over the legislative changes is solely focused at the right-wing element of this new government. It's not actually about the nature of the Israeli state. I mean, I think it's quite telling that one of the slogans taken up by this protest is to love Israel is to denounce it. I think this is where you can begin to see actually the sort of contradictions of these protests that are fighting against the Israeli government, because they don't take up the question of Palestinians and they don't have any sort of solidarity with them amongst them. It's not really a criticism of the occupation of Palestine, it's more an argument about how best to occupy Palestinians. I think it's an important point, because in my last sort of 5 minutes or so, it brings me on, and I think the current situations that you see within the Israeli state then bring you on to actually explain what I said at the beginning. How is it that Palestine can be free? When you look at what's going on in Israel, you can see that there is no solution within it. People ask, let's look to the left. it saddens me to say that the left over decades has been erased within Israel. I mean, in the previous election, the so-called Labour Party that used to dominate Israeli politics held just 6 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. The legislative bill around citizenship that I mentioned had just 8 votes against it, and they came from the very small amount of Arab parties that are represented in the Knesset. So then you begin to see actually, well, why is it that there can be no sort of solution about cross-solidarity between Israelis and Palestinians? Well, it's the nature of settler colonialism. In order for settler colonialism to justify itself, they have to have an ideology whereby which one group of citizens has, a right to the land over another. And I think, again, it brings into the question around why a two-state solution could never work. There's big arguments around the settlers, the colonies and annexation. If Israel was to broaden its borders and encroach them into Israel, then the promise of 1948 that Israel would be a majority Jewish state completely disappears. However, if you were to have a two-state solution, i.e. an unchained Palestinian population on Israel's borders, that completely brings in, again, a massive crisis of the legitimacy of the Israeli state. So I think when you begin to see some of the political dimensions that are taking place within Israel, you can then see, well, clearly we cannot turn to any sort of left, even if it were to have existed in Israel, because of the nature of Zionism. However, then, I think in my final 4 minutes, I'm watching the time, Celia, I'll be quick, maybe 5 or 6. Then I think we have to say, well, then who is it? Who can actually bring about liberation in Palestine? Because we're not fatalists. We think these things can actually happen. And I think it's worth noting, like I mentioned, the protests and the intifada that we saw in 2021. And I think it's really interesting, some of the sorts of resistance that we saw come out of that, because it was a real starting point. Because it's worth noting, what was unique about the Unity Intifada, the reason why they called it the Unity Intifada, was that for a long, long time, resistance was sort of concealed to the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza. However, what you saw in 2021 was a massive national outpouring of Palestinian solidarity. Within Israel's borders, the Palestinian flag was being flown, but not just within every single corner of Israel, but actually every single corner of the world. As I mentioned, we had a massive demonstration here. Actually, that 7 million Palestinian diaspora that I spoke about at the beginning were completely awakened to the fact, despite the fact that the Israeli government has done everything in its might to try and stamp out any sort of form of national identity or national pride from Palestinians. I think it was a really important point that we saw. And I also think, of course, on May 18th, the general strike actually did have a big impact on the Israeli economy. However, I would argue it doesn't go far enough. And that's actually because of the nature of imperialism within the Middle East. Actually Palestinians cannot win alone. Guerrilla warfare or the types of armed resistance that you're seeing in Jenin and Nablus at the moment, again, quite interesting because they're in complete contradiction with the Palestinian Authority. It's meant to, have rule, but often Palestinians say they're under 2 occupations. The occupation from the Israeli state, but also the Palestinian Authority that spies on them, leaks information to the Israeli government and so on. They cannot win alone. Israel, as I'm sure many of us are aware, are the biggest receiver of US military aid. They are an entire cyber state, the kind of technology and warfare and weaponry that they develop, which the entire Israeli economy is based off of. This is where, they get the majority of their GDP and all of their income from, is this sort of warfare state. I mean, people describe it rather than a state with an army. Israel's an army with a state, it's the other way around. Actually, the might of Israel means that Palestinians cannot win alone. But there's also the question of imperialism in the Middle East. Why is it that the US backs Israel? Well, we know that the Middle East over years has been a place of instability, a place of war and interest for Western imperialism. But it's worth noting, Israel is the biggest receiver of Israeli military. Israel is the biggest receiver of US military aid. Egypt is the second. Al-Sisi's government and the army within Egypt act as a border guard within Gaza. I think it's a really important point to make out, because actually that's when you begin to see that the route to Palestinian liberation lies beyond the working classes of the entirety of the Middle East. And it's worth noting that, Palestinians and the Palestinian working class are not confined to the borders of Palestine or Israel. Palestinians make up the majority of the population within Jordan. There's 200,000 Palestinians in Lebanon. There's 500,000 Palestinians living and working in Syria. And I think when you begin to see these, you can see that actually the struggles that go on within these states that line themselves up with Israel, line themselves up with US, often in a battle against Iran at the moment, actually when you begin to see struggles against these rulers, when they take up the question of Palestinian solidarity, that's when they can win, not just to behead their own tyrants and dictators and oppressive governments in those countries, but actually liberation for Palestine. And if you look at the whole prehistory of revolutions in the Middle East, if you think about the revolts in Algeria in 1988, completely inspired by the first Intifada in Palestine in 1987. But of course, think about the Arab Spring, 2011, the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt. I mean, the whole prehistory of these revolutions was awash with Palestinian solidarity. The people involved and who knew about how to take off the head of their own state saw the question of international solidarity with Palestine at its very heart. And I think this is the kind of thing that we have to focus on, because it gives us actually big questions of hope, because the ruling classes of all of the states in the neighbouring regions of Israel in the Middle East, they fear a Palestinian revolt. They fear a Palestinian revolt because they know about the deeply held support for Palestinians amongst every single Arab country amongst the working class, and they know that can be a challenge to their rule. So look, just to finish with really, why hasn't this happened? Why didn't it happen in the Arab Spring? I would argue the Arab Spring was an amazing revolution. It was broad, it went wide, it touched almost, no one could get away from talking about it, but the Palestinians didn't go deep enough. Why didn't it go deep enough? It didn't uproot the structures of the Egyptian army, now, as I said, that act as a border force in Gaza. And I think in order actually to deepen those revolutionary processes, the argument for a revolutionary organisation, a party that is, worked in the arguments around imperialism, that fights for organisation against the counter-revolution and the oppression from the state, when you rise up those sorts of arguments and really fight for them trade union solidarity and so on, then you can begin to actually see the revolutions. Because I think the imperialist system within the Middle East traps both Palestinians but also the masses of ordinary people across the region in a complete nightmare of poverty, oppression and war. And I think the final thing I want to say is that if we want to see a breakdown of US imperialism in the Middle East, of which Israel is the glue that holds it together, if you want to break down a system or a Jenga tower, for example, you go for it at its weakest points, right? I can guarantee you that the weakest points of that imperialist system in the Middle East do not lie within Israel's borders. In fact, they're probably some of the most strongest points. Therefore, what we have to fight for is, a support of the Palestinian resistance, international solidarity with that, but actually we want to see a flourishing of resistance across the Middle East that sees, when you see it takes up the question of Palestine, it begins to get a bit of a revolutionary nature. A question about arguing that without imperialism, without states and so on, we'll be able to win, full liberation, not just for Palestinians, but actually full liberation for oppressed people all across the globe. So I'll leave it there. So.